What?
It's more than just another LA story. It's not sensational like we think of sensational in Hollywood, and yet it's all about sensation. And it's not big like Hollywood big, but it is global and relevant to the whole being, the entire story of people and of interaction and of, well, life. And the more I know, the more I do realize, and this is something that Steve always says, the whole universe is dancing.
Well, I've known him for years, and I thought I knew what he did, you know. But I'm just beginning to understand the scope and the importance of his art. I'm just beginning to get the big picture, you know, and it's a big picture. You know, it was a day like today, kind of like now. I'm driving across the 210, taking him to Cal Arts. And I got the radio on, and a Pink Floyd tune comes on, Learn to Fly. And I mentioned that, you know, it's one of my favorite Pink Floyd songs, and he reaches over and he cranks up the volume. And he's, you know, he's motioning me to just keep quiet. He's listening to the song, he's listening to the song like he's never heard it before. And he says, I've never heard it before outside of the studio altogether. And then he drops the bomb. That's me. That's me, I'm playing percussion. Pink Floyd, Momentary Lapse of Reason. And that's Steve Forman. And that's just the tip of another iceberg, you know? I thought I knew what he did. You'll see.
I was a really very immature, kind of maladjusted 9-year-old from a somewhat dysfunctional family who finally found something that I could do that, if not something that was respected, at least gave me some satisfaction. And that's just like, you know, I would go off in grade school and tap on a book with drumsticks.
Steve, when did you begin to think of yourself as a percussionist?
Gosh, pretty much since I think I was about 9 years old, in one way or another. When I finally found something I could kind of do better than other kids. And that's been it. It was drums then, you know, a snare drum, but it's been carrying me straight away all this time, yeah.
Tell us what your very first percussion instrument was.
It was a little parade drum, a little mahogany 14-inch parade drum. And I can remember my first professional gig. I was 12 years old, and I had to dress up in a bunny suit and play in a bunny band in an Easter parade in some resort in Arizona. And they paid us, I don't know, $6 or $12 or something, and gave us some Easter eggs. That was my first real professional gig. I hadn't thought about that till you asked me that question. Yeah, it was in a bunny suit.
So, was it always your intention to become a studio musician?
You know, and I didn't know, have no idea. Even when I was in college, even when I was starting my career, I never would have imagined that I would be able to survive as a studio musician. I thought, oh, those guys like have to be the best players in the world. They have to sight read anything, and there are guys who can, of course. But no, I just, you know, started tapping on a book and I just followed the path. I just kept doing what was good. The only time, really, in high school where I felt like I was in part of a group was in the band. So when I graduated from high school, I thought my career would be to become a band director. It was the only time I was happy when I was in high school, was in the band.
How old were you when you wrote your first composition?
I was a senior in high school, trying to get, really kind of snow job my way into some kind of scholarship in a local university in Arizona. So I wrote a duet for trumpets because I knew the band director was a trumpet player. And in my application, I made it look like I was really invested in becoming a composer.
And tell us how your love of percussion has evolved over the years.
Well, I think it went in stages. You know, I went like through school music and stuff as a little kid, and then by the time I got to college, I became very interested in timpani. And I was very fortunate. I was at Arizona State at the time, the first time I was in college. And at that time, they had a very nice orchestra, about an 89-piece orchestra, pretty good orchestra but it was a big university, but it was not as big as it is now. And it was possible for me as an undergrad to actually play timpani for 4 years in that orchestra and in the symphonic band. And after about a year, I started working in the Phoenix Symphony as well. So while I was in college, although I was a terrible college student, really disorganized, I just got to do tons of playing. All I did the whole time I was in college to me it was a big music camp. For 4 years I played in all those orchestras. Every other performing group I could possibly manage to fit into the schedule, and played drums at night in country western bands and rock bands and jazz bands. So after 4 years, I got out of there nowhere near any kind of a degree, probably closer to a degree in composition. But what I didn't understand at the time was that about 6, 7 years later, when I wound up in Los Angeles, I had exactly the right background for a studio musician. I played every kind of style of music without a particular attitude about one being any better than the other, and just, not a virtuoso at anything. I've never been that kind of player. I'm not a virtuoso player, but I've always just been able to hear the whole orchestra, the whole thing, the big picture. I've approached it as a composer, with the composer's attitude, and the percussionist's practicing skills.
One of the things that I think about with Steve is that in addition to being just sort of a consummate studio musician, with all the requisite technical skills and the reading capability and knowledge of all the orchestral canon, all the major symphonic works and so forth. Almost over and above that, and in some ways I think even more importantly than that, he's also one of the most creative people that I've ever known. And the combination is really potent. It's really potent.
Because it's so broad, it's so diverse. Percussion, when people hear that word, they're likely to think two things. They'll think maybe drummer is the most common reaction. They think of somebody playing a snare drum, or they think of somebody playing a drum set, most often in a pop band. The other thing I think people might think with that word is a musical instrument where somebody hits something to make a sound. Now in the 21st century with music the way it is, that there are very few rules and very few limits.
I was still in the Phoenix Symphony at the time, and somebody approached me to write, somebody that wanted to be a record producer in Arizona. And that resulted in me writing what I thought was a rock and roll music at the time. He gave me 2 things to listen to and sent me off to listen. And so I started writing. And at the time I was very influenced by what a guy here in Los Angeles was doing, a guy named Don Ellis, who had created this amazing big band with lots of horns and stuff that at that time was like experimenting with odd rhythm concepts and stuff. It was revolutionary at the time. He's largely forgotten now, but it was very astonishing to those of us that were interested in jazz at the time. So I did sort of a rock and roll version of what I thought had something to do with that, something to do with the 2 or 3 records that I had listened to. I really hadn't listened to much. I didn't know much when I started. And then all kinds of wacky, goofy ideas that came to me. And we put together a band, which actually got signed on Capitol, which got me out of the symphony business and into entertainment. You're not through. What will you do? How should you feel when you found everything you can feel and you still feel unreal? You're unreal. How do you feel? Changed my life. And then I started learning what was really going on in entertainment, and I started really listening to a lot more pop music, and it was wonderful. I really ran with it. And so I guess by the time I was 26, I had been in Los Angeles for a couple of years, and had been playing in a lot of what they used to call rehearsal bands here, bands that were not really bands that actually performed much, but the writers, the composers, and the guys that wanted to be arrangers would have these rehearsal bands at the Union. I played in a lot of those, and one of the guys that was a colleague of mine that played in one of those bands was also a member of Loggins and Messina, and he recommended, I guess they were going into a transition, a change in personnel, and I was invited to audition, and the next thing I knew, I was on the road with Loggins and Messina, and that was an amazing year. I mean, I learned so much, and that's what made me a really good conga player. I mean, that's where I kind of like really do it, because I'm playing every day and every night, and that took me a huge distance.
Do you think the intensity of touring with musicians like Loggins and Messina broke you through to a new level?
Absolutely, because first of all, playing every day, you just get a stamina, and you are what you do. That's my mantra. So I'm playing every day, so I'm getting to be a better player. After that band finally decided that they couldn't afford all these frills and extras like a percussionist, I came back to LA, but I came back being a pretty strong player. I still really knew nothing really about Latin music, but I had a really good groove, and I had invented this kind of style of playing with lots of strange instruments. When I first started, you know, I didn't have any real gear, so I was using frying pans and found objects, hubcaps out of the river, and all kinds of goofy stuff, which became sort of my style of playing, and I guess became a model for a lot of other people. And now it's kind of a standard idea of having a lot of bells and sound effects. You'll see percussionists and bands all the time doing that. But when I was doing that in the early 70s, nobody had ever seen anything like that.
The atmosphere among studio musicians early on, it was highly competitive, highly competitive. And there were so many really competent players here in LA during that time, and Steve was one of them. But there were some things that set Steve apart from some of the other players, technical expertise and creativity, which really makes him a really unusual musician, I think. I do believe that Steve is one of the more creative people in the world, really. And he, if a film composer came to Steve, and Steve knew in advance that there was a particular scene that he was going to be required to play on, it might take him a few days or even a few weeks, but he would be involved in a 24-hour-a-day creative process. And if I were along for a ride, I might witness him disappearing into a supermarket and coming out with bags full of seemingly useless objects: bamboo skewers, matches, rubber bands, balloons, bags of beans. You just never knew what was going to become an instrument to Steve. In fact, I would say that everything on the planet is potentially an instrument to Steve.
So I found myself back in Los Angeles after that tour, and it created a lot of attention among musicians in the studio, because nobody had seen anything like that. At that time, recording percussionists were of two sorts: guys that were basically orchestral kind of players, or people that were Latin musicians that probably didn't read music at all, and when they needed somebody to play congas or a Latin part, they'd hire one of the Latino guys, and he'd come in and he'd do it intuitively. I was the first guy who could come in and play those kind of instruments and read the music as well, and plus get away with playing a xylophone part or a marimba part. Never my best instrument, but I had, after 4 years at college, I was able to get by. And whenever somebody said, "Can you play this?" I always just said yes. I was young and cocky, and and "Do you have one of those?" And I'd write it down and say, "Yes, of course," and got off the phone and bought one and tried to figure out how to play it. And that's how I learned to play a lot of instruments and became the kind of player I was.
Has your career unfolded according to plan?
I never thought about how it was unfolding. I just kept saying yes and enjoying it. I started off playing the snare drum. I was very, very fortunate to quickly be placed in front of two amazing teachers that influenced my worldview and my attitude towards rhythm and jazz early on. I started my first drum lessons. My first drum lesson was with my uncle, who had a music store, and he gave me one lesson, taught me how to play paradiddles, taught me how to play brushes, which to this day is the best lesson in brushes I ever had, and then really didn't want to be bothered with teaching his nephew how to play drums, so he turned me on to one of the guys that was teaching in his studio. That was a fellow named Pete Magadini. At that point, I was just entering high school or about to enter high school, and Pete was several years ahead of me in the same high school. But Pete was a jazz bebop guy, and he's very much alive. He lives in Canada right now, and was a terrific influence on me. He taught me almost from the first moment that the most important thing about playing drums was keeping good time. It didn't matter how many notes you played. It wasn't about being flashy, playing lots of crazy drum solos and stuff. It was just about ding, 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 you know, keeping that groove. And that was the most important lesson anybody ever gave me. So I worked with Pete for about a year, and then Pete turned me on to his teacher, who is a brilliant educator and drummer and jazz musician, I think now retired, maybe has passed on, a guy named Don Bothwell, also in Phoenix. And Don was a tremendous influence to me. Who was a harsh teacher, you know, never gave you any gratuitous praise. It wasn't until 20 or 30 years later that some of his other students got back to me, you know, told me that Don actually did think the world of me at the time, but I wouldn't have known it. I just knew that, boy, I better be ready when I came into the lesson, and I managed to keep up with it. He was a great teacher, inspiration. Okay, and then after that, I found myself in college, discovered timpani, started listening to classical music, which I loved, worked in the symphony, which just completely opened my mind up to playing some of the world's greatest music. You know, it was a community orchestra, it wasn't a world-class symphony, but to my ears and my experience, it might have been the New York Phil, you know, it was just, and I got to dress up in a wool tuxedo with tails and white tie, and walk out there and play Mussorgsky's Ravel's Pictures at Exhibition, Firebird Suite, fantastic music. So it was kind of hard to let go when I let go of the symphony stuff to pursue the pop record. You know, I used to cry at night a little bit because I missed the repertoire so much. But had I stayed in there, I probably would have spent my life in a community orchestra and not moved forward. So, you know, I never asked, I never really sought a path. I just kept following what was interesting and what was challenging and what was learning. The same thing happened when I got to Los Angeles, got off the road, got done with Loggins and Messina, and was invited to play with a guy named Lee Ritenour, who at the time was the hot young fusion jazz guy in Los Angeles. And he had a band with people that had been my idols, people that I had come up in college kind of like worshiping. Dave Grusin was in his band, Anthony Jackson, an unbelievable bass player from New York, was in that band. And above all, a drummer named Harvey Mason, who's a brilliant drummer out of New York, was Lee's guy. And they still play together quite a bit. And Harvey just intimidated the hell out of me. I was scared to death of Harvey. But it was good. I mean, I was always the weakest guy in the band, and I had to work the hardest to keep up. So I was always pulled forward, pulled up, pulled forward, all the way.
You've played with so many musical legends. Can you tell us who influenced you the most?
No, but I could give you like a short list of people that I'm very grateful for having been able to work with. I wasn't in that many bands. What happened when I met Lee Ritenour and started playing in this group, I was perceived as an associate member of that community, and suddenly I found myself the next young studio musician in town. And that became my career for the next 30 years. It changed nature. But the best of it was early on when I was doing lots and lots of records. At that particular time, computers weren't there, the drum machine hadn't been invented. There were live musicians on every commercial, every record, every television show, every film. And it was 99% of it was done here in LA. There were hundreds of studios. I just kind of walked in, ready to do it with the right skill set at the peak of that business. And it was never it was never much better than it was the first 8 or 10 years I was doing it.
Steve had kind of a special relationship with a few composers, a number of them. An example of how it worked when, you know, a film composer would come to Steve and maybe the bare bones of a scene had been scored, but often what would end up happening is that the composer would just turn over the scene to Steve and say to Steve, do what you do. Steve became known for his kind of creative approach, and they would just ask him to do what you do best. And Steve would find all kinds of ways of, you know, supporting the narrative of the film with color and texture and atmosphere. He would invent sounds, sample things later on, you know, during that part of his career. He would sample things, often thought and played like a composer, which is, I think, that was part of the appeal that, you know, for composers, is that he thought like them, he almost approached things. When it came to film scores, he had a really good narrative way of thinking about things, and he had the musical chops to support it. So he was very effective in doing that.
So, to answer your question, among the many people I was able to record with were James Taylor stands out. I did 2 or 3 records with James, and it was just a delight. Just a delight, that's all I can say. An elegant man. The music was really wonderful. And because I had this relationship with Loggins and Messina, I worked with Kenny Loggins on a couple of his early solo projects. And I've always really admired him, and he brought me forward in a different sort of way. Kenny is a very extremely disciplined in his own way. You know, some people would call it a control freak, but what it is he just had a very clear, exact idea of what he wanted. And I had to learn how to be able to provide that, when naturally I'm more inclined to improvising and never doing anything the same way twice. With Kenny, I had to learn how to really nail somebody else's idea early on. And that made me a much more effective studio musician in some other situations that were, like I did a record with Cat Stevens one night, and Cat was very much like that too. It wasn't a lot of fun for me, but because I'd had, you know, been through the wars with Kenny, I knew how to manage it. You know, I knew how to get through it, and I understood that my job at that point was to help those artists realize their vision, not my vision, their vision. So it's a different kind of playing. And sometimes it was the same thing. I did a lot of work with a band that might be forgotten now called Poco. I did 2 or 3 records with Poco, and those guys, you know, I just loved what they did, and it was like as if I'd always been in the band working with them. And they were part of the Loggins and Jim Messina community too at the time. So in a way, it kind of was part of the same community. Who else comes to mind? Well, everything I did with Lee Ritenour was a road to advancement. The most important thing that happened out of all of that, beyond my studio career, the thing that really changed my life and the way I understand music and informs me to this day, was about halfway through my experience working with Lee, the guys from New York, Anthony Jackson went back to New York. Patrice Rushen was playing piano in that time, and she moved on to a solo career. And what we did is we made a change in the band. It was called Friendship. And 2 guys joined the band that became important influences and close friends and teachers and mentors to this day. That was Alex Acuna, who had just recently left Joe Zawinul's band, Weather Report. Alex played in Heavy Weather and all those, the peak, most important recordings of Weather Report. And a bass player came up from Mexico named Abraham Laboriel. Now today that name is associated with Abraham Laboriel Jr., who is the drummer with Paul McCartney. But when I knew Abe Jr., he was 4 years old. He was Abe's son. And we used to talk about Abe Jr.'s taking lessons from Alex, and how we had to get him a really cool, Abe had to get him a very interesting drum machine because he was bored with the metronome and all that. Anyhow, Abe was taking lessons from, or Abe Jr. was taking lessons from Alex Acuna as a 6-year-old, and as a 26-year-old, or closer to 30 maybe by then, I was studying and learning about clave and Latin music, and we played together for, a good 3 or 4 years in that band. We toured multiple tours of Japan. We did 2 or 3 trips to Montreux, Sweden for that jazz festival. And it was the absolute best band I had ever played in my life till then, you know, to this day. Another member of that band is a guy named Ernie Watts, who's just still today my favorite American jazz tenor player.
Lee Ritenour and his friendship group.
that band was always in tune, always balanced, always musically focused, whether they were rehearsing in a living room or they were on a stage in front of 20,000 people. It was always 100% focused on the music. And the keyboard player was Don Grusin, Dave Grusin's brother. Amazing band. And all of those people were tremendous influences on me. I grew so much from that. I'm so grateful for that opportunity.
Was it always in your heart to be a composer?
In fact, I only came to understand this recently when I finally let everything go and decided to devote my life to be a composer. That, in fact, I always really did want to be a composer, but I never had the confidence, so I always hedged my bets. I was a composer and a timpanist. I was a composer and a drummer in a rock and roll band. I was a songwriter or something else, but I was always a studio musician. Even when I got to the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, I was still hedging my bets. They accepted me as a PhD postgraduate student in composition, but I said, but I also want to do research on a percussion instrument, which is the bowron, the Irish bowron, the Celtic drum, which I do really love. But after a year of that, like trying to do essentially two different kinds of PhDs at the same time, one practice-based research and the other actually musicology, which I had no background in at all, I found myself really ripped apart. I was always guilty, no matter what. If I was composing and letting my research, my musicological research, go idle and felt guilty. If I was doing, working on writing, academic writing about the bowron and doing field research, interviewing bowron players, I was neglecting my compositions, and so after a year of that, I said, okay, where is the joy in it? What did I really get the most satisfaction from last year?
I always knew that Steve wanted to compose, but he never really showed us many compositions. But when I got together with him privately and I saw that he was working with computers and writing and composing those days, he'd show me things then. So I'm really happy, Steve, that you have moved on and you're pursuing your doctorate, teaching and composing. I knew that you had this composing gene, as you'd showed me a few things here and there, so I'm really happy for you. Congratulations, and get that doctorate.
And I loved composing. Every composition was becoming to me an adventure. It would start off with just the most vaguest idea, and at the end of the piece, I would have been taken on a journey. It was almost like an out-of-body experience, and this is how it is now. When I do have a good piece going, I don't know what it is until it's 2/3 of the way through. And then something happens, it clicks in, it's like something goes flash, or you have this insight and you go, oh, that's what this piece is about. This piece is about, for example, a recent piece that I thought was all about dragonflies buzzing around a pond or something. Turned out to be, no, it had actually turned out to be a piece about learning how to unlock code without a key. It's called cryptanalysis. And it sounds like Morse code. And when I understood that, by the time I got to the end of the piece, in fact, I embedded messages in it in Morse code. And it's a wonderful piece. It's being recorded as we speak here in Los Angeles. Part of the reason I'm here right now. It's getting its first recording. It hasn't been played in public yet. And every piece is like that. They're all been completely different. They're all kind of just like going into the woods and coming out into a whole new landscape. It's this amazing thing. And to be honest, you know, my hearing, my ear, and all of that is still like woefully underdeveloped compared to lots of composers and conductors and people doing what I'm doing. But I'm just so blessed because I'm learning so fast. Now that I'm actually focusing on this, it's becoming very fulfilling, and I'm learning every day.
This summer, when Steve has come back to Los Angeles and we've had a chance to sit for several weeks and record 2 of his ensemble pieces, 3 Chances and Sloop Dreams, as well as 2 solo pieces, mostly Moondust and Cryptanalysis. This will represent, this body of work will represent Steve's chamber music specifically for percussion. And I think it's really exciting to think about what he has generated without really having heard too many performances of it live. You know, this is just his experience that's been put down on paper. I think it's really exciting to think about where he can take his composing after this point.
Steve's relationship to music is singular, I think, to film scoring, records, contemporary music, pop music. He has a really unique perspective on things. His career has spanned sort of the analog age and the transition from that to the digital age, and he's been deeply invested in both and continues to be. And it has, it's given him a body of experience and a body of knowledge it really is kind of unlike anybody else. There are a few other people who've been around during the same times as Steve, but his experience is pretty unusual. And as time went by, there was less work to go around, and it was complicated by the idea that things were often that film scores and records, the percussion that would be overdubbed on it was often accomplished by way of synthesizers. It was all digital after a while, and so there was less and less work to go around, and competition was fierce. One of the things that I have always admired about Steve is that he, rather than responding defensively, Steve found it within himself to pass his knowledge along. Steve's extremely generous in that way, always has been. New people would come to town, new players, and they might find their way to him, and he would end up showing them how to build instruments, would introduce them to other, to composers and contractors. He would talk to them about playing techniques. And he would just share everything that he knew, and what he knew and knows is formidable.
Describe how you felt the first time you experienced one of your compositions brought to life by an orchestra.
It's only happened recently, actually, that I've gotten performances on my compositions anyway. At that level. I was fortunate enough to have a piece I wrote for a full symphony orchestra played last year by the Royal Scottish National Orchestra at the Celtic Connections Festival. It was the first time I'd heard any of my orchestral kind of orchestrations played, and it was amazing. It was so exhilarating for me because the orchestrations worked, the orchestra sounds beautiful, and it was like really a thrill. Yeah, just getting to that. It's just happening now, really.
So recently, I was looking at the footage of your complete collection, and I suddenly had a realization moment about the scope of it.
Yeah. The hope is that I'm going to be able to open a space in Glasgow where it can be stored and then used by the symphonies there and other percussionists. Because they have very little in the way of anything that's not non-standard orchestral stuff. This century, percussionists have to do more than play, the percussive triangle parts. They've got to know more.
Do you remember the moment when you realized that the scope and potential of your collection had outgrown even your own career?
Not until just this moment. See, my collection, although it's I've got, as you probably know, I have somewhere along the order of 60 ATA cases full of stuff. But it was most of it is stuff that I just acquired to be able to do what I was doing the way I work, which is kind of a little bit different from the way many other studio musicians work. I was kind of a guy that focused on records and special, so I would have boxes and boxes of different kinds of shakers and cowbells, where a regular film musician studio percussionist might have 3 or 4 shakers. That's fine. I'll have 40, I'll have drawers full of those things, because for me, on a record, there's a certain sound, depending on the tempo and the orchestration. It's just one sound that's just right, physically and acoustically. So my collection is set up so that I could just go the whole distance to exactly the right sound.
As a matter of fact, I have here, I dug this up and I brought this along here. This is probably 25 years old. I used to take a lot of herbs, and these plastic bottles, you know, I would throw them away, and then they would get removed from the trash and saved. And they're filled, these at any rate, are filled with tiny beads, little beads that probably would become a necklace. Gaffer's tape. Could never be without a lot of gaffer's tape. And, you know, these seemingly useless objects drawn out of the trash would become an instrument. This is a shaker that Steve played on lots and lots of records and film scores and stuff. You never know. And so late at night, Steve dragged this thing, which weighed a lot, and it was probably maybe, I don't know, 5 feet, maybe by 10 feet. It's huge. It was crumpled. And Steve dragged it into his studio and figured out a way to flatten it, more or less, and suspended it on pulleys from the ceiling of his studio. And then it became what then became known as the thunder chute. And depending on what kind of mallets or the flat of your palms, depending on how you played it, it could make a noise that sounded frighteningly like a 747 taking off next to your ear, or it could sound like a distant summer storm somewhere on the horizon, approaching slowly, you know, very moody, very subtle. are certain certain objects that Steve would become sort of obsessed with. The first one that comes to mind are the very tiny metal film canisters for 35 millimeter film. He hoarded them when they stopped making them. When he heard that they were going to stop making them, he hoarded them because they make the ultimate shaker. Another thing, I guess it must have been in the early 80s or maybe even earlier, Legs pantyhose used to come in a hard plastic egg-shaped container. And for years, Steve used them to make instruments from. And when he heard that they were going to stop packaging them that way, he began to hoard these eggs from Legs pantyhose. Unfortunately, I didn't wear pantyhose at the time, or it would have been a good thing for me, but it wasn't. So we just had mountains of these eggs. And what Steve would do is he would open them up, and he would select the perfect size ball bearings and put just a few of them. It had to be exactly the right number of ball bearings inside this egg. And then if he flicked his wrist perfectly, the ball bearings would crawl up the side of this plastic egg and whirl around for a remarkably long time. It would make a whirring kind of whooshing sound that will go on and on. And so, Legs pantyhose, you just never know what would be an instrument. He was just, he's an inventor, and it really set him apart and in terms of the studio business, both on film score dates and on record dates.
And we got away with that for a long, long time until it became so expensive at the end of the 80s to cart all that stuff around that most, record producers, for example, couldn't afford it. Especially when I got into electronic percussion. There was a period, because you had to rent the electronic equipment because it cost $20,000 a year just to keep it at broadcast quality, that before I ever played a note, between the cartage, the guys hauling the gear, and setting up the electronics and the rentals, I cost $1,000 before I ever played a note. I had inadvertently kind of priced myself out of my career. But I was certainly not the only one in that position, and everything had to change. I experimented. One experiment was to open up my own little recording studio in Venice Beach, where I put half of my equipment, which on paper still looks like a massive amount of stuff, and got some good microphones and decent preamps, and had a lot of composers come visit me, so they didn't have to play the cartage.
Well, I met Steve probably the better part of 10 years ago at an Irish session in San Diego at a pub called The Field down in the Gas Lamp. And my husband and I were down there one Sunday afternoon just jamming along with the session, and all of a sudden we both got this strange feeling, and we turned around and there was this guy behind us playing the baron in a way that neither of us had ever heard that instrument played before. We were just mesmerized, and we went home talking about it. And then a couple months later, when we went to put together our band, one of the band members suggested that we give this guy a call. And I was like, oh, you mean the guy that played Baron from LA? And he's like, yeah, give him a call. And I thought, well, he's not going to come all the way down from LA to play a weekly gig. And he said, we'll just try him. So I called him, and sure enough, he agreed to do it. He agreed to come down on the train every week and do our regular session. And we were just, I can honestly say, beyond thrilled, because he was leagues beyond what we could have anticipated getting in the way of a percussionist for our band. And it was only many weeks or months later that I came to realize who he is in terms of his, you know, exalted resume. And I was pretty blown away at the time. And I was thumbing through a Dave Matthews liner note from one of my favorite albums, and I saw his name, and it just hit me. Wow, this guy plays with us in our band. That was really neat.
So Annie, how was it that Steve came to be involved in your music?
Well, after being in the Kitchen Fire band for several years, I started writing songs for the first time. Steve was very encouraging of that process, and so I got a phone call from him a while later, and he said, "Oh man, woo, you go girl, you're doing it." And that was a big deal to me. So when many years later I put together the Flims duo project, Steve came forward and volunteered to do the arrangements. He said, "Did you know that before I was a percussionist, I was actually an arranger?" And I said, "Did not know that," but I wasn't surprised. He's sort of a jack of all trades, musically speaking. So I didn't really understand what that meant, but I knew that we intended to have string parts, and I knew we were going to have horn parts on the album. And God, am I ever glad he volunteered to do that, because he had, you know, music for each of the various instrumentalists, and I can't imagine how long it took him to pull that together, but he did. And he just, you know, handed the sheets out and just began sort of directing everybody, and it was a beautiful thing to watch.
I ask myself why I insist that you do the dirty work I refuse to do, while I am standing with one foot outside the door. Meanwhile the other one is dancing. It's a video.
Look at me standing with one foot outside the door. Here I am nailing down the other to the floor.
Oh, this tug of war. Well, this tug of war. Like a flower collapsing on itself. That's what it is.
So you and Steve knew each other for quite a while before you recorded the Flims album together. What was it like when Amy, your partner in the Flims, met Steve for the first time?
That was really fun. I didn't know how they would hit it off. They're both kind of big personalities, and as it turns out, they ended up being thicker than thieves, and to the point where I was actually really jealous.
That's all. That much.
Gotcha.
2 inches, and you'll be fine. Because the blend is great.
Why don't you sing louder? It's hot, okay.
Look, she's.
Stick up
It's like my studio. I'll tell her what to do.
Don't stick up for that girl.
Don't make them throw darts at your head.
Hey, look, you know, we were driving around. You were like just chopping garlic, and we had a moment. So now we're just.
Oh, now you're all fucking bonded.
Things are like, it's a different thing now, okay? So.
Did you cry?
I did it.
Yeah. Sorry.
Because I thought I was the favorite, and Amy turned out to be the pet, and he took her under his wing, and he really spent a lot of time working with her on her percussion techniques for our live shows. So he got her up to speed on the washboard, and the triangle, and the shakers, and the noisemakers, and the kazoos, and the whole thing, and that was really fun. But when they'd be off working together, I'd be sitting in the corner, feeling very left out. But it was really fun to see them together, because they're both funny people, and they had a good time.
So tell us a little bit about your experience in the studio working with Steve.
Again, you know, Steve comes into a room and it's impossible to not fall in love with him. Everybody that worked on this project ended up just feeling very close to him, and like they'd known him all his life, and we all walked away with a very deep appreciation and respect for his professionalism, for his creativity, for his people skills. He just brought the best out in everyone, and made us all laugh nonstop. because he's whimsical, he's playful. You know, he's played with John Lennon, he's played James Taylor. I mean, he's been with the biggest and the brightest, and I feel like, you know, working with our little project, he brought that same Steve-ness that he probably brought to everything that he ever has worked on, and it was magical. I felt really honored.
So what's a funny little nugget you can share with us about working with Steve?
I think my favorite memory in the studio is when he was directing our drummer, and I didn't know how that would go, but as it turned out, they hit it off just swimmingly. And I remember on the first day when they were laying the rhythm tracks, Steve was sort of, you know, nudging Nucci in a certain direction with this one particular song, and sort of directing him, telling him how to do it, and Nucci's just sitting there with the sticks in his hands, looking at him kind of quizzically. And then all of a sudden Steve just stopped, and he threw up his hands and he said, no, scratch that. You just be the genius that you are.
Do your legendary play like really something very hip right there when you get to that spot, so that we'll all be excited.
Do what you do. He walked away, and Nucci laughed, and he did it, just the way Steve wanted him to.
So what's new with Steve Forman?
Now I'm learning how to teach, and that's opened a window to a whole nother great mystery having to do with rhythm and rhythm systems. I'm so excited about it, you know, like what there is, the work lies ahead. I'm really excited about it.
Now you're beginning this new path.
Yeah.
And considering now all the possibilities, where do you guess Steve Forman will go from here?
Well, I'll be doing less playing. And that'll just be an incidental thing. More composing and a whole lot more teaching, and like giving back, paying forward, I think is an expression people use sometimes. Just being able to share all this stuff, my experiences, and hopefully get other people excited too. And I'll be able to compose. I'm really suddenly finding myself excited about teaching, and I'm in a situation where, you know, I'll be able to do that with really good, extremely capable young people who can, you know, eat this stuff up. If I can explain it right, they'll get it. So that's I'm thrilled about that too.
So then what advice would you give to the young percussionists today?
Number one, practice. You are what you do. Just be playing every day, and just say yes. If somebody says, "Can you do that?" Say yes, and go do that. And just, you know, just follow the groove. You know, follow what you love. And I would also, a practical answer is, you need to compete in today's talent pool. You need to know something about the world's music, and as well as the orchestral set. You need to go beyond just orchestral repertoire. The guys that are really going to be working in the future are going to be working in orchestras and outside of orchestras. Orchestras are kind of dying off, but music is going to march on, and you need to know something about the world's music.